Hey guys, tonight we're pulling up a cozy blanket, maybe grabbing a warm mug of something soothing, and stepping into the frosty, often misunderstood world of Norse mythology. You picture it, right? Crashing waves on jagged shores, snow-capped mountains piercing the bruised twilight sky, and maybe, just maybe, the distant rumble of thunder that isn't thunder at all, but the heavy footsteps of something ancient and immense. You're tucked away safe and sound, but out there, in the swirling mists of Jotunheim, things are stirring. You probably won't survive 5 minutes if you actually stumbled into that world unprepared, clutching your phone for light. It's a realm of primal forces, powerful gods, and yes, giants. But tonight, we're not just talking about the club-wielding brutes you see in the movies or hear about in the most famous tales. We're going to whisper about the surprisingly thoughtful, sometimes gentle, and often incredibly wise giants who inhabit the quieter corners of these old stories. They're not all just mindless monsters waiting for Thor to bash their heads in. Some of them are keepers of secrets, possessors of ancient lore, and even, dare I say it, quite sophisticated in their own way. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. As you settle back, let your mind drift to the image of the Norse cosmos. You might envision Asgard, the gleaming home of the Aesir gods, and Midgard, the world of humans, nestled precariously below. And then, often depicted as a wild, untamed frontier on the edges of existence, lies Jotunheim, the home of the Jotnar. The name itself, derived from the Old Norse word Jotun, is usually translated as giant, though some scholars suggest it might originally have meant something closer to devourer, or one who eats. Regardless of the precise etymology, the common perception, solidified through centuries of retellings and adaptations, paints a picture of the Jotnar as the eternal, brutish antagonists of the gods and humanity. They are the forces of chaos, the embodiment of wild, destructive nature, always plotting, always threatening, always needing to be fought and subdued by heroes like Thor. Think about the stories you might already know. Thor's many exploits often involve him traveling to Jotunheim to challenge giants in feats of strength, or simply to smash them with his hammer, Mjolnir. There's Utgard Loki, who tricks Thor and his companions with illusions, presenting a formidable intellectual challenge, yes, but still ultimately portrayed as a deceptive, hostile force. There are the giants who try to steal goddesses, like Oiamar, who demands Freya in exchange for Mjolnir, or the giant builder who tries to wall Asgard and demands Freya, the sun, and the moon as payment. These are the headline giants, the ones who fill the sagas with action and conflict. And they certainly exist. No denying that. The Norse myths are full of epic battles and divine smackdowns, and the Jotnar often play the role of the big, bad guys you love to see the heroes overcome. But the Norse mythological landscape, preserved primarily through the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, texts compiled centuries after the Viking Age itself, a mainstream historical fact, by the way, much of what we know comes from Icelandic sources written in the 13th century, is far more expansive and nuanced than just a simple good versus evil narrative. These aren't just action-adventure tales. They are complex tapestries woven with layers of cosmology, history, prophecy, and wisdom. And within these layers, nestled between the accounts of thunderous battles, are quieter moments, stranger encounters, and figures who don't fit the simple, brute mold. Imagine the vastness of this mythological world, stretching out beyond the familiar battlefields. There are stories where gods travel to Jotunheim not for combat, but for counsel. There are tales where giants possess knowledge that even the gods lack. There are figures who are related to the gods, intertwined with their lineage in ways that make the simple enmity seem, well, less simple. It's like assuming everyone in New York City is a fast-talking, impatient stockbroker because that's who you see in the movies. The reality is always more varied, more textured. These less discussed giants are the ones we're going to focus on tonight. They appear in specific poems within the Eddas, sometimes in prominent roles, sometimes just mentioned in passing, but always adding a layer of complexity to the Jotun race. They challenge the stereotype of the dim-witted, purely physical foe. Instead, they reveal a side of the Jotnar that is ancient, wise, sometimes melancholy, and occasionally, surprisingly gentle or at least capable of coexisting, even intermingling, with the divine. Consider the sources again. The Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems, contains some of the most ancient and vivid accounts. The Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson, is a later compilation and retelling, intended partly as a guide for skaldic poets. Historians still argue whether Snorri accurately reflected older traditions or if he shaped the myths to fit his own Christian worldview and literary purposes. This debate is particularly relevant when looking at the Jotnar, as their portrayal can seem inconsistent across different sources and even within the same source. Are they chaotic demons, or are they simply an older, wilder race representing primal forces? The answer, as is often the case with mythology, seems to be, it's complicated. We'll delve into specific stories, like the time Odin risked everything to gain knowledge from a giant, or the strange courtship of a god and a giantess that ended up shaping the landscape and the seasons. We'll meet giants who are parents to gods, guardians of ancient wells, and even those who find a place, however uneasy, among the Aesir. These aren't the giants who just swing clubs. They are figures who engage in riddles, demand justice, mourn their losses, and hold keys to understanding the very fabric of the cosmos. Perhaps one of the most intriguing aspects, a slightly quirky or fringe tidbit you might not encounter often, is the idea that Jotunheim isn't just a barren wasteland of ice and rock. While it's often depicted as a wild and dangerous place, some descriptions hint at vast forests, mighty rivers, and even halls where giants gather and feast, suggesting a society, albeit a different kind, exists there. It's not just a place of raw nature but a distinct realm with its own inhabitants, rules, and ancient wisdom. So, as you listen, let go of the default image of the clumsy, evil giant. Open your mind to the possibility that these ancient beings, the Jotnar, were seen by the Norse peoples not just as simple villains, but as complex entities representing forces of nature, primal power, ancient knowledge, and perhaps even a wild, untamed beauty that stood in contrast to the ordered world of gods and men. We're peeling back the layers tonight, looking beyond the thunder and the shouting to find the quiet whispers of thought and even, dare I say it one more time, gentleness in the hearts of these surprising giants. So you're letting go of that standard image, the one where every giant is just a bigger, dumber version of a troll under a bridge, right? Good. Because the Jotnar, the beings we're talking about, are far more than that. The term itself, Jotun, plural Jotnar, is the Old Norse word, and as we touched on, while it's commonly translated as giant based on their often immense size, the exact meaning is still something historians and linguists ponder. Some suggest it links back to words implying eating, or devouring, hinting at their potentially chaotic or destructive aspect, while others propose connections to roots signifying greatness, or age, linking them to primordial forces and ancient lineage. Whatever the root, the Jotnar in the myths aren't a monolithic group. Think of them less like a single species of monsters and more like a vast, ancient race with incredible diversity. Yes, there are absolutely the mountain-sized brutes who want to smash Asgard or steal Freya's necklace. Because who wouldn't want Freya's necklace, honestly? It's fabulous. These are the ones Thor is constantly squaring off against, the embodiment of raw, untamed power and chaos threatening the ordered cosmos. They represent the wild frontier, the unpredictable forces of nature, the sheer destructive potential that exists outside the cultivated realms of gods and men. But then there are others. You encounter giants who are described as wise, possessing knowledge that predates the gods themselves. Giants who are cunning strategists, capable of intricate deceptions like Utgard Loki, who outwits Thor not through brute strength, but through illusion and intellect. Giants who are beautiful, like Geir, whose radiance captivates the god Freyr, leading him on a quest that changes his destiny. Giants who are melancholic, mourning their losses and seeking justice, like Skadi, who comes to Asgard demanding compensation for her father's death. Their appearance varies wildly too, at least based on the descriptions we have. Some are described with terrifying features, craggy, mountainous, perhaps even monstrous. Others are simply noted for their immense size. And then you have figures like Geir, whose beauty is legendary. This isn't just about physical traits, it speaks to a fundamental difference in their portrayal. They aren't just big ugly things, they can be ancient, elemental forces, or individuals with complex personalities and appearances. It's like trying to describe all humans based only on the loudest person you've ever met. You'd miss a lot. A mainstream historical fact to consider here is that the concept of giant-like beings representing primal, chaotic forces is a common theme across many Indo-European mythologies, not just Norse. Think of the Titans in Greek myth, or other primordial beings in various creation stories. The Jotnar fit into this broader mythological pattern, representing the older order, the raw material of the cosmos, which the younger gods, like the Aesir, must contend with, shape, and sometimes even incorporate. They are the other, the force against which divine order is defined, but their nature isn't always purely antagonistic. Consider their relationship with the gods. It's not just one of perpetual war. Yes, there's conflict, often brutal. But there's also intermarriage. Odin, the chief of the gods, is himself the son of a god, Bor, and a giantess, Besla. Many other gods have Jotun ancestry or take Jotun spouses. Frey is married to Geir. And J.R. marries Skadi, though it doesn't go well, we'll get to that. This constant intermingling of bloodlines complicates the simple narrative of eternal enemies. It suggests a more fluid boundary between the realms, a recognition that the power and wisdom of the Jotnar cannot be simply ignored or destroyed. One quirky or fringe tidbit that sometimes gets overlooked is that while Jotunheim is often depicted as a desolate, cold wilderness, some poems hint at internal structures and even a form of society within the Jotnar realm. We hear of halls where they gather, suggesting complex dwellings beyond mere caves. This implies a level of organization, perhaps even culture, distinct from the gods but not entirely absent. It adds another layer to the idea that they are more than just wandering monsters. They inhabit their own world, with its own rules and inhabitants. The scholarly debate often surfaces around the precise nature and origin of the Jotnar. Are they truly representative of chaotic, anti-cosmic forces destined to bring about Ragnarok? Or are they simply an older, wilder, elemental race that existed before the gods established their order, representing the raw, untamed aspects of the cosmos that the gods must manage but cannot fully eliminate? This interpretation suggests they are less evil and more different, embodying natural forces that are necessary for the world's balance, even if they are dangerous. It's like fire, essential for warmth and forging, but utterly destructive if uncontrolled. So, as you settle deeper into your blanket, imagine this complex picture. The Jotnar are the ancient ones, perhaps even the ancestors of the gods themselves. They hold keys to forgotten history and future prophecies. They can be terrifying in their power, yes, but they can also be sources of profound wisdom, figures of striking beauty, or individuals driven by relatable emotions like grief and a desire for justice. They are not just the background villains. They are integral threads in the rich tapestry of Norse myth, representing the wild, wise, and sometimes surprisingly gentle aspects of the cosmos that lie just beyond the familiar. We're about to meet some of these specific individuals who truly challenge that simple giant equals monster equation. So, you're shifting your perspective now, seeing the Jotnar not just as a single blob of bad guys, but as a diverse group, right? Good. Because even if you just skim the surface of the myths, before you get to the really detailed stories of specific giants and their interactions with the gods, you can find these subtle hints, these early glimpses, that suggest the Jotnar weren't always seen purely as the chaotic, brutish opposition. It's like spotting a tiny wildflower pushing through the cracks in a seemingly solid rock face, a sign that there's more going on beneath the surface. One of the earliest, most fundamental figures in Norse cosmology is connected to the Jotnar, and his role is central to creation itself, not destruction. I'm talking about Ymir. Remember him? The primeval giant, the very first being to exist, who emerged from the Ginnunga Gap, the yawning void between the realms of ice and fire. The myths tell us that from his body the gods, specifically Odin and his brothers Vili and Ve, created the world. His flesh became the earth, his blood the seas and lakes, his bones the mountains, his skull the sky, and his brains the clouds. Even the dwarves are said to have originated from the maggots in his flesh, a slightly less glamorous beginning than some might hope for, I guess. Now, Ymir's story isn't exactly a tale of a gentle giant having a tea party with the gods. The gods killed him to make the world, which is pretty dramatic, even by mythological standards. But his significance lies in his role as the source material. He wasn't an antagonist plotting against the gods. He was the primordial entity from which everything sprang. He represents the chaotic, unformed potential of the cosmos before order was imposed. In this sense, he's less a villain and more a fundamental, elemental force. This early, foundational myth shows a giant figure not as an external enemy to be fought, but as the very ground upon which existence is built. It's hard to get more integrated than being turned into the planet you live on. This idea of giants being tied to the most ancient aspects of the world pops up in other ways too. Think about lineage. We already touched on Bestla, Odin's mother. The chief god, the All-Father himself, has a giantess for a mom. This isn't a secret, hidden shame, it's just part of the divine family tree. It's like finding out your cool, powerful friend's grandma was a famous rock star, surprising maybe, but definitely part of who they are. This connection at the very top of the divine hierarchy suggests a long-standing relationship between gods and giants, one that predates the major conflicts described in later tales. It implies a time, or perhaps a different dimension of existence, where the lines between Aesir and Jotnar were blurrier. A mainstream historical fact here is that genealogical lists and origin stories were incredibly important in Norse society, just as they were in many ancient cultures. Knowing your ancestors, whether human, divine, or even giant, established your place in the world and your connections to the past. The fact that the Eddas openly list giantesses in the ancestry of prominent gods like Odin underscores that these beings were considered integral to the mythological history, not just late-stage invaders or monsters. These early mentions also hint at the Jotnar possessing knowledge that even the gods might lack, particularly concerning the deep past and the fundamental workings of the cosmos. While specific tales like Vafnir's wisdom contests come later, the idea that giants are repositories of ancient lore is present from the beginning. They are the old race, connected to the world's origins in a way the younger gods are not. This isn't brute strength, this is intellectual or perhaps even instinctual understanding of the cosmos. It's like asking your great-great-grandparent about life before the internet. They just have a different, deeper perspective. Consider figures like Mimir, often associated with giants, who guards the well of wisdom. While his exact nature and origins are debated, is he a giant, one of the Vanir, or something else entirely? His connection to ancient knowledge and his role as a guardian of wisdom place him firmly outside the simple, brutish foe category. He's a keeper, a source of profound understanding, someone even Odin must sacrifice greatly to learn from. This paints a picture of Jotunheim, or at least the fringes associated with giants, as a place not just of danger, but of hidden, valuable knowledge. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some early poetic Edda verses, particularly in cosmological poems, list names of giants that aren't associated with specific conflicts or stories, almost as if they are simply cataloging ancient beings or forces. These lists sometimes include names that seem tied to natural phenomena or geographical features, further reinforcing the idea that the Jotnar were perceived as intrinsically linked to the raw, untamed world itself, rather than just being humanoid monsters living in it. They were aspects of the landscape and the elements. Historians still argue whether the earliest layers of Norse myth viewed the Jotnar primarily as primordial cosmic forces or if they were always seen as distinct, often hostile, beings. Some scholars suggest that the conflict narrative became more prominent over time, perhaps influenced by societal changes or the need to define divine order against chaos, while the older layers might have simply presented them as part of the fundamental structure of the universe. This open scholarly debate highlights that our understanding of the Jotnar has evolved, and the simple, monster, interpretation might be a later emphasis rather than the original view. So, even in these foundational elements, the creation myth from Ymir's body, the presence of giantesses and divine genealogies, The association with ancient knowledge, you see the seeds of a more complex understanding of the Jotnar. They are tied to the very fabric of existence, they are ancestors of the gods, and they are keepers of wisdom. These aren't the club-swinging simpletons, these are figures woven into the deepest layers of the Norse worldview, suggesting that their nature, even in the earliest conceptions, was far more nuanced than just being the bad guys. They were the ancient ones, the wild ones, and the ones who held the keys to understanding where everything came from. Picking up from that idea of giants being tied to ancient knowledge, keepers of secrets even the gods might not fully grasp, let's dive into a story that is perhaps the absolute best illustration of this. The tale of Odin and the incredibly wise giant Vafnir. You know Odin. The All-Father, chief of the Aesir, god of wisdom, magic, poetry, and war. He's constantly seeking knowledge, isn't he? He sacrificed an eye for a drink from Mimir's well. Remember Mimir, the guardian of wisdom we touched on, often linked to giants or ancient beings? He hung himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days and nights to learn the runes. This guy is obsessed with knowing everything. So, when he hears whispers, perhaps even in his own thoughts prompted by the ravens Hugin and Munin, that there's a giant out in Jotunheim named Vafnir who is renowned for his immense wisdom and knowledge of the cosmos, the past, and the future, well, Odin just has to go there. His thirst for knowledge overrides his caution, even his fear. This isn't a casual road trip, though. Jotunheim is dangerous territory for a god, especially the chief god. So, Odin decides to go incognito. He adopts the guise of a traveler named Gangr, which translates roughly to Master of Strife, or He who advises to victory. A fitting name for someone about to engage in a battle of wits with potentially fatal consequences. Imagine Odin, cloaked and hooded, walking into the heart of enemy territory, not with Mjolnir or Gungnir, but with nothing but his mind and his disguise. It's a high-stakes gamble, like sneaking into a rival company's board meeting to steal their trade secrets, except the penalty for getting caught is probably much worse than just getting fired. He arrives at Vafnir's Great Hall. Now, this isn't some ramshackle cave. The poem Vafnism, where this story is primarily told, describes a significant dwelling. Vafnir is portrayed as an imposing figure, immediately suspicious of the stranger. He challenges Odin as Gagger right away, demanding to know who he is and why he's there. This isn't a friendly welcome. Vafnir is clearly used to being the smartest person in the room, or the hall, as it were, and isn't about to entertain just anyone. Odin, sticking to his disguise, claims to be a traveler seeking hospitality. But Vafnir isn't easily fooled. He proposes a test, a wisdom contest, a game of questions and answers. The stakes? Well, they are implied to be incredibly high. In some versions of such contests in Norse literature, the loser forfeits their head. Vafnir declares that only the one who proves wiser will leave his hall alive. This isn't just a friendly pub quiz, it's a duel where knowledge is the weapon and ignorance is deadly. The contest begins, and it's a fascinating back and forth that fills many stanzas of the poem. Vafnir, confident in his vast knowledge, asks questions about the structure of the cosmos, the names of the horses that pulled the sun and the moon, the plane where the final battle of Ragnarok will take place. Odin, in turn, asks about the origins of things, the oldest of the gods and giants, the fate of various beings during the end times. What's remarkable here is the sheer depth of Vafnir's knowledge. He doesn't just know surface-level facts, he possesses intricate details about the cosmic order, genealogical lines stretching back to the beginning of time, and prophecies about the future that seem incredibly specific. He names the primordial river, the field where the gods and giants will meet their doom, the beings who will survive Ragnarok. This giant isn't just physically imposing. He's a living library of Norse cosmology and eschatology. That's the study of the end times, fancy word for a giant who knows how it's all going to go down. A mainstream historical fact to consider here is the importance of wisdom contests and riddle-solving in ancient Germanic and Norse cultures. These weren't just forms of entertainment. They were serious intellectual duels, often depicted in sagas and poems as ways to establish dominance, resolve disputes, or gain crucial information. The Vafnism is the prime example of this genre in Norse mythology, highlighting that intellectual prowess was valued alongside physical strength, even among beings often stereotyped as purely physical. The questions fly back and forth, each revealing more about the structure of the Norse world and its inevitable fate. Vafnir answers every question Odin poses about the cosmos and its history. Odin answers every question Vafnir asks about the gods and their realms. The giant is clearly incredibly knowledgeable, matching Odin blow for blow in this mental sparring match. It seems like Odin might not be able to stump him. Then comes Odin's final question. He asks Vafnir what Odin whispered into the ear of his son, Baldur, as Baldur lay dead on his funeral pyre before being sent to Hel. This is a deeply personal, intimate secret between Odin and his deceased son, something only Odin himself could possibly know. Vafnir is struck silent. He immediately recognizes the nature of the question. It's not about the cosmos, or history, or prophecy. It's a question about the innermost secrets of a god. He realizes that only Odin himself could ask such a question, because only Odin would know the answer. The giant, defeated not by lack of knowledge about the world, but by a question about the private heart of the Allfather, concedes. He acknowledges that his opponent is Odin and that Odin alone possesses knowledge of such profoundly personal divine secrets. He says, in the poem, something to the effect of, "No one knows that save you, the old foe of the giants, and I knew when you came under my roof that you were Odin." A quirky or fringe tidbit about this specific poem, Vafnism, is that it contains some of the most detailed and unique information about Ragnarok found anywhere in the Eddas. Many of the specific names and events associated with the end of the world, like the survival of certain gods and humans, or the renewal of the world afterward, are described in Vafnir's answers. This suggests that the giant was seen as holding not just historical knowledge, but also unique prophetic insight into the ultimate fate of the cosmos. So, what does this story tell us about Vafnir and the Jotnar? It presents a giant figure who is the antithesis of the brutish stereotype. Vafnir is ancient, yes, and powerful, but his power lies in his intellect and memory. He is a scholar, a cosmologist, a prophet, a keeper of lore that predates the current age of gods and men. He respects the rules of the wisdom contest, even when it leads to his own defeat. He is a formidable opponent, but one defined by his mental capacity, not just his physical size. He represents the Jotnar as not just forces of chaos, but as reservoirs of deep, ancient understanding. Historians still argue whether the specific prophecies and cosmic details revealed in Vafnism represent genuinely ancient Norse beliefs about the end times, or if they are a more structured, perhaps even slightly systematized, compilation of lore that was being put together by the poets and compilers of the Eddas centuries later. This debate highlights the complexity of interpreting these texts. Was Vafnir's wisdom a reflection of truly primordial giant knowledge, or a literary device used to convey the fullest known extent of Norse cosmology at the time of the poem's composition? Regardless of the scholarly debate about the poem's age or the ultimate source of Vafnir's knowledge, the story itself stands as a powerful counterpoint to the simple giants equal monsters narrative. Here, the chief god must humble himself, risk his life, and rely solely on his own wisdom to gain knowledge from a giant who is his intellectual equal, if not superior, in certain aspects of cosmic lore. Vafnir is a giant, yes, and an old foe of the giants, as he calls Odin, but he is portrayed primarily as a figure of immense wisdom and ancient authority, a surprisingly thoughtful and deeply knowledgeable being residing in the heart of Jotunheim. This wasn't a tale of smashing heads. It was a tale of minds colliding, and the giant held his own until the very end. So Odin won? Not with Mjolnir smashing mountains, but with a single, unanswerable question that pierced the giant's vast, ancient knowledge. He walked into the lion's den, or perhaps more accurately, the ancient library in the heart of Jotunheim, disguised as a traveler, and emerged victorious, having paid no price other than the risk itself. But the real prize wasn't just winning the contest. It was everything Vafnir revealed before that final, killer question. This giant wasn't just a big, strong guy who knew a lot. He was a living, breathing chronicle of the cosmos, and Odin, and by extension, the audience of the poem, got access to that incredible database of lore. Think about it, Odin went there specifically because Fafnir was known for his wisdom. And the giant delivered. The questions and answers cover an astonishing range of topics, painting a detailed, if sometimes fragmented, picture of the Norse mythological universe. Fafnir spoke of the very origins of existence, describing the primeval age before the earth was made, when Ymir first came into being from the drops of venom that fell from the icy rivers called the Ilivigar. He knew the names of the first frost giants born from Ymir's armpit sweat, yep, armpit sweat. A glamorous beginning for the ancient race, right? Makes you appreciate modern deodorant. He detailed how the earth was formed from Ymir's body, echoing the creation myth we touched on earlier, but giving it more specific names and details. He knew the names of the horses that pulled the chariots of the sun and the moon across the sky, and the names of the plains and rivers that exist within the cosmic landscape. He described the dwelling places of the gods, the giants, and other beings. He knew the names of the oldest gods and the oldest giants, tracing lineages back through the mists of time. It's like he had a super-powered search engine in his brain, cross-referencing every piece of cosmic history and geography known to the Norse world. You ask him where the sun goes at night, and he doesn't just say, "Behind the mountains." He gives you the name of the horse that carries it and the specific path it takes. But Fafnir's knowledge wasn't just historical or geographical, it was also prophetic. He spoke extensively about Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods and the inevitable end of the current world order. He knew the names of the beings who would fight in the final battle, the fate of specific gods and giants, and the terrible signs that would herald the coming doom, like the Fimbulwinter, the long, harsh winter that precedes the end. He even knew which few gods and humans were fated to survive the destruction and inherit the renewed world that would emerge from the sea afterward. This wasn't just guessing. This was presented as foreknowledge, an ancient giant's insight into the predetermined fate of the cosmos. This level of detail about Ragnarok is particularly significant. The Vafinism poem is one of the primary sources for our understanding of the Norse apocalypse. Many of the specific events, characters, and even the idea of a world reborn are laid out in Fafnir's answers to Odin's questions. It's a bit ironic, isn't it? The giant who is often seen as representing the forces that bring about the end is also the one who holds the most comprehensive knowledge about that end, and even about the potential for renewal afterward. He's not just a force of chaos, he's the custodian of the ultimate cosmic narrative, including its conclusion and epilogue. A mainstream historical fact here is that eschatological myths, stories about the end of the world, are common across many cultures and mythologies. They often serve to explain natural disasters, provide a framework for understanding change and renewal, and offer moral lessons. The detailed portrayal of Ragnarok in the Eddas, partly through Fafnir's account, fits into this broader pattern of human societies grappling with concepts of time, fate, destruction, and potential rebirth. What makes Fafnir particularly thoughtful isn't just the amount of knowledge he possesses, but the kind of knowledge. It's not practical knowledge about building ships or forging weapons. It's deep, fundamental understanding of existence itself, where everything came from, how it works, and where it's going. He is the expert on cosmic history and future, a giant scholar holding court in his ancient hall. His defeat comes not because his cosmic knowledge is incomplete, but because Odin asks a question that transcends the public, shared knowledge of the cosmos and delves into the private, personal realm of the divine heart. It's like winning a Nobel Prize in theoretical physics, but failing a pop quiz on your best friend's embarrassing childhood nickname. A quirky or fringe tidbit about the Vafinism is the sheer density of names and specific details it provides. For scholars studying Norse cosmology and genealogy, it's an invaluable, albeit sometimes challenging, resource. It lists names of rivers, mountains, giants, gods, dwarves, and even specific halls and locations within the 9 worlds, often providing unique information found nowhere else. It reads almost like a mythological almanac or encyclopedia compiled by a being with an impossibly long memory, making Fafnir seem less like an individual character and more like the embodiment of ancient, encyclopedic lore. Historians still argue whether the specific details about cosmology and Ragnarok presented in Vafinism represent genuinely ancient Norse beliefs passed down orally for centuries, or if they are a more structured, perhaps even slightly systematized, compilation and elaboration of existing traditions by the Icelandic poets and compilers of the Eddas in the 13th century. This debate highlights the challenge of reconstructing ancient beliefs from medieval texts. Are we seeing a snapshot of truly primeval giant wisdom, or a sophisticated literary construction designed to present a comprehensive overview of Norse lore through the dramatic frame of a wisdom contest? Regardless of the debate, the portrait of Fafnir remains striking. He is a giant, yes, and an opponent of the gods, but his power is intellectual. He sits in his hall, surrounded not by weapons of war, but by the weight of millennia of cosmic history and prophecy. He is a keeper of secrets, a repository of knowledge that even the All-Father deems worth risking his life for. He represents the Jotnar not just as primal forces or brutish foes, but as beings intrinsically connected to the deepest layers of the cosmos, possessing a wisdom that is ancient, profound, and surprisingly thoughtful. He's the ultimate history buff, just, way bigger and living in a different dimension. So, you've seen how a giant like Fafnir could be a repository of cosmic wisdom, a being of immense intellect rather than just brute force. That challenges the stereotype significantly, right? But what about giants in more personal interactions with the gods? Not just in battles of wits, but in relationships? Because the lines between gods and giants weren't always as clearly drawn as simple enmity might suggest. Sometimes they blurred, particularly when it came to matters of the heart, or perhaps, strategic alliances sealed by marriage. Enter Freyr, the handsome and beloved god of the Vanir, one of the two main tribes of gods, remember? The Vanir are generally associated with fertility, wealth, and seafaring, distinct from the Aesir's focus on war and order, though they later merged. Freyr is sunshine and good harvests and prosperity. Not exactly the kind of god you picture getting involved with the forces of chaos. Yet Freyr falls deeply, instantly, and utterly in love. And the object of his affection? A giantess named Geir. The story is primarily told in the poem Skirnismal, the Lay of Skirnir. It begins with Freyr sitting on Odin's high seat, Hliskjof, which gives the sitter the ability to see across all 9 worlds. This is a bit of a forbidden act, and like many times characters mess with forbidden things in myths, it leads to trouble. From this vantage point, Freyr looks into Jotunheim and sees a beautiful maiden walking from her hall. The poem describes her radiance lighting up the sky and sea. This is Geir, daughter of the giant Ymir. Freyr is immediately smitten, struck by a lovesickness so profound that he can neither sleep nor eat, and refuses to speak to anyone. His father, Njrr, and his mother, possibly Skathi, though this is debated, become worried and send Freyr's loyal messenger and servant, Skirnir, to find out what's wrong. Freyr finally confesses his lovesickness for Geir and asks Skirnir to go to Jotunheim on his behalf to woo her and bring her back to be his bride. This is where we encounter Ymir, Geir's father. Skirnir agrees to undertake the perilous journey into the land of the giants, but only in exchange for Freyr's magical sword, a powerful weapon that can fight on its own, which Freyr later regrets giving away, especially come Ragnarok, and his horse, which can ride through fire. Armed with these gifts, Skirnir sets off. He arrives at Ymir's dwelling. The poem describes it as a formidable place, surrounded by flickering flames and guarded by a fierce watchman, or maybe a pack of wolves, depending on the translation. Either way, not a welcoming committee. Skirnir manages to get past the guards and approaches Geir's hall. Now, how is Ymir portrayed? He's not depicted as a rampaging monster immediately trying to smash Skirnir. Instead, when Skirnir arrives, it's Geir who first notices the commotion and sends a servant to see who has arrived. When Skirnir states his purpose, that he has come to woo Geir for Freyr, we get the reaction from Ymir's household. Geir herself is initially resistant, not eager to marry a god. She lives in a secure, seemingly prosperous hall. Her father, Ymir, is presented as the head of this household, the patriarch whose consent, or at least acquiescence, is required. Ymir is not shown engaging Skirnir in combat. His presence is felt more as the formidable protector of his daughter and his home. He is a giant of high status, living in a place of power and wealth within Jotunheim. Skirnir has to use various tactics to persuade Geir, initially offering her gifts of gold and rings, which she refuses, then resorting to threats and curses to compel her to agree to meet and marry Freyr. These threats sometimes involve invoking the power of giants or magical beings, and even threatening to use magic that will make her miserable and unwanted by any other being. The fact that Skirnir has to use such extreme measures, and that Geir is initially defiant, speaks to her own agency and the strength of her family's position, headed by Jymir. While Jymir himself doesn't have a starring role in the dialogue of Skirnismal, his status and the security of his home are central to the narrative. Skirnir isn't just kidnapping Geir. He's negotiating, albeit aggressively, for her hand, implying that her father, Jymir, is a figure of authority whose daughter is not easily taken. This portrayal of a giant as a settled, powerful father figure living in a defended hall is quite different from the image of wandering, destructive brutes. It suggests a degree of structure and status within Jotunheimer society. A mainstream historical fact to consider here is the significance of marriage alliances in Viking Age society. Marriages between powerful families or even between different tribes or groups were crucial for establishing peace, securing resources, and consolidating power. While the myths are not historical records, the theme of marriage between gods and giants, even those seemingly at odds, reflects a cultural understanding of alliance building through kinship, suggesting that even the divide between Asgard and Jotunheim could, in theory, be bridged by marriage. The story culminates not in a battle with Jymir, but in Geir agreeing to meet Freyr in a specific location, the Grove of Bari, 9 nights later, where she will become his wife. This outcome means Jymir ultimately allows the marriage to proceed. He doesn't storm Asgard demanding his daughter back, nor does he seem to wage war on Freyr for taking her. Freyr gains his bride, a giantess, and she becomes part of the divine world, though she seems to remain connected to her home in Jotunheim. Jymir becomes the father-in-law of a major god of the Vanir. A quirky or fringe tidbit often discussed by scholars is the potential connection between Jymir and the sea giant Aegir, who is also sometimes called Jymir. While the identity is debated, Aegir is known for hosting lavish feasts for the gods in his hall at the bottom of the sea, a place described as wealthy and welcoming, at times. If Jymir is indeed Aegir, it further cements the idea of a powerful, settled, and even hospitable giant figure, albeit one associated with the wild, unpredictable sea rather than the mountains of Jotunheim. This would paint an even more complex picture of the giant's relationship with the gods. Historians still argue whether Gymir's relatively passive role in Skirnismal, where the focus is more on persuading Geir than overcoming her father, reflects a specific tradition about this particular giant, or if it's simply a narrative choice driven by the poem's focus on the courtship aspect. Does it mean Jymir approved? Was he simply unable to stop Skirnir, despite the formidable defenses? Or does it represent a different facet of giant-god relations, where negotiation and alliance were sometimes possible outcomes? Regardless of the scholarly debate about his exact nature or the implications of his actions, or inactions, Jymir in Skirnismal is clearly not the archetypal brutish giant. He is a father, a patriarch, the head of a significant household in Jotunheim. His daughter is highly valued, and her hand is sought by a god. His domain is secure, suggesting power and status. He ultimately allows a marriage alliance with the gods, making him Freyr's father-in-law. This portrayal adds another layer to the complexity of the Jotnar, showing them not just as external threats, but as beings with their own societies, families, and perhaps even the capacity for forming complex relationships, even kinship, with the divine. He's less like a monster guarding a princess, and more like a formidable, perhaps slightly intimidating, father of a sought-after bride. Just, giant-sized. So, you've seen how giants could be repositories of ancient wisdom like Fafnir, or even formidable patriarchs whose daughters marry gods like Jymir. These aren't the simple brutes of stereotype. And speaking of giants who become intricately connected to the gods, often in surprising and complex ways, let's turn our attention to one of the most striking and independent giantesses in the myths, Skadi. Skadi is a giantess of the mountains, a figure associated with skiing, archery, winter, and hunting. She is the daughter of the giant Jotsi, a powerful and fearsome giant in his own right, who once managed to kidnap the goddess Ion and her youth-restoring apples. Remember those apples? Kept the gods from aging? Yeah, Jotsi caused a temporary panic in Asgard by snatching them. Loki, being Loki, was involved in the kidnapping, both helping Jotsi and then being forced by the gods to get Ion back. Loki, shape-shifted into a falcon, found Ion and carried her back to Asgard, pursued closely by Jotsi in his eagle form. As Jotsi reached the walls of Asgard, the gods lit a great fire, which Jotsi, unable to stop his flight, flew into, killing him. Now imagine you're Skadi, high up in your mountain home. You hear the news that the Aesir, the very gods who dwell in the supposedly ordered realm of Asgard, have killed your powerful father. How do you react? Do you weep silently? Do you cower in fear? Not Skadi. She is a giantess of the mountains, tough and resolute. Her reaction is one of profound grief, yes, but also a burning desire for justice, for retribution or, at the very least, for adequate compensation for this immense loss. This isn't just a monster being defeated, this is a daughter losing her parent and demanding accountability. So Skadi straps on her skis, because of course she's the goddess of skiing, which is a pretty cool gig if you asked me, even if it means spending a lot of time in the cold, grabs her bow, and sets off for Asgard. She arrives at the gates of the god's fortress, not as a cowering supplicant, but as a fully armed warrior, ready to take on the entire pantheon if necessary. She is a force of nature, embodying the wild, untamed power of the mountains and the cold, and she is here for answers and for payment. This arrival is a powerful statement, a single giantess, confronting the collective might of the Aesir, driven by personal loss and a sense of righteous anger. The gods, faced with this formidable, grieving giantess at their doorstep, don't immediately resort to violence. This is a crucial moment that challenges the simple gods versus giants war narrative. They recognize her claim, her grief, and perhaps the potential for a long and costly war if they refuse to negotiate. Instead of Thor swinging Mjolnir, Odin steps forward to parley. They agree to offer her terms of settlement, a wergild for her father's death. A mainstream historical fact here is that wergild, literally, man price, was a fundamental concept in ancient Germanic and Norse law. It was a system of compensatory payments made to the family of a person who had been killed or injured, as an alternative to blood feud. The amount of wergild varied depending on the victim's social status. The gods offering Skadi wergild for Jotsi's death reflects this real-world legal custom being applied in the mythological realm, acknowledging Jotsi's status and Skadi's right to compensation according to the customs of the time, even across the god-giant divide. Skadi, being the demanding and independent figure she is, sets her terms. And they are interesting. She doesn't just ask for gold or land. She demands things that will satisfy different aspects of her loss and her nature. First, she says the gods must make her laugh, something she feels incapable of doing in her grief. And who do the gods turn to for this impossible task? Loki, of course, the very trickster responsible for her father's death, at least indirectly. Loki, ever the showman, performs a truly bizarre act. He ties one end of a cord to his testicles and the other to the beard of a goat. The resulting tug-of-war, and Loki's yelps of pain, are so utterly ridiculous that Skadi bursts out laughing. It's crude, it's painful for Loki, presumably, and it works. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that this specific scene with Loki and the goat's beard is one of the most famously strange and debated moments in the Eddas, often interpreted as a moment of ritualistic humiliation or a representation of boundary-pushing performance art within the mythological context. It certainly satisfies Skadi's demand for a laugh, fulfilling the first part of the wergild. Second, Skadi demands a husband from among the gods. The gods agree, but they impose a condition: she must choose her husband by looking only at their feet. This is presented as a way to make the choice impartial, perhaps, or maybe just another layer of divine cleverness, or trickery. Skadi looks at the feet lined up before her and chooses the pair she deems most beautiful, assuming they belong to Balder, the most handsome god. However, she is mistaken. The beautiful feet belong to Njrr, the god of the sea, winds, and wealth, who has spent his time by the ocean. This leads to her difficult marriage to Njrr, which we'll delve into in the next section, highlighting the clash between her mountain nature and his sea-dwelling preferences. Third, and perhaps most touchingly, Skadi demands that the gods take her father's eyes and place them as stars in the sky. This is done, creating a lasting memorial to Jotzi, visible to everyone in the cosmos. This act elevates her father from a defeated foe to a permanent fixture in the night sky, honoring his memory and Skadi's familial bond. It's a powerful symbol of her successful negotiation and the gods' willingness to grant a giantess a unique and cosmic form of tribute for her loss. It's not just about winning a fight, it's about acknowledging grief and finding a way for different realms to coexist, even after conflict. Imagine looking up at the night sky and knowing those two stars are the eyes of a giant, put there because his daughter demanded it. Pretty profound, right? This entire episode with Skadi's arrival, her demands, and the god's response paints a picture of a giantess who is far from a simple monster. She is driven by relatable emotions, grief, anger, a desire for justice. She is powerful and brave enough to confront the gods directly. She is shrewd in her negotiations, demanding terms that go beyond simple material wealth to include emotional satisfaction, Loki's humiliation, personal connection, a husband, and eternal remembrance for her father, the stars. She is integrated into Asgardian society through marriage, albeit on her own terms, even if those terms lead to complications later. Historians still argue whether Skadi's successful negotiation and partial integration into Asgard represents a genuine attempt by the myths to portray giants as capable of alliance and complex relationships with the gods, or if her story is primarily a narrative device to explain the origin of certain cosmic features, Jotzi's eyes as stars, and the lineage of specific gods through her marriage to Njrr. This open scholarly debate highlights the difficulty in interpreting the underlying message about the nature of giants in these varied mythological tales. Is she an exception that proves the rule of enmity, or evidence of a more complex, sometimes fluid relationship between the realms? Regardless of the debate, Skadi stands out as a giantess of immense character and agency. She comes to Asgard seeking justice, not just mindless destruction. She negotiates with the gods as an equal, demanding and receiving significant concessions. She is a figure of winter, mountains, and independence, who forces the gods to acknowledge her loss and her power. Her journey, from grieving daughter seeking vengeance to reluctant bride integrated into the divine world, shows a giantess who is thoughtful in her demands, resolute in her purpose, and ultimately, a figure who complicates the easy categorization of Jotnar as simply the brutish other. She's like that tough, quiet kid from the mountains who shows up at your school and demands respect, and gets it. So Skadi, the tough mountain giantess, had arrived in Asgard, demanded justice for her father, made Loki perform a truly questionable act with a goat, and some rope to make her laugh, which, honestly, is a story that probably deserves its own cozy night by the fire sometime, and then chose her husband from among the gods based solely on their feet. She picked Njrr, the god of the sea, winds, and wealth, thinking those beautiful feet belonged to Balder. Talk about a classic case of judging a book by its cover, or a god by his feet. This choice, based on a foot fetish-adjacent selection process, Njrr, but the myth said it, led to a marriage that was, let's just say, geographically challenged. Skadi, daughter of the mountains, lover of snow, cold, and the quiet wilderness, was now married to Njrr, god of the sea, who resided in his beautiful hall, Noten, Shiptown, by the shore. You can already see the potential for marital bliss, right? It's like marrying a deep-sea diver when you're a competitive Everest climber. Different strokes for different folks, but maybe not compatible strokes for shared living quarters. They tried to make it work, bless their mythological hearts. They agreed to a compromise. They would spend 9 nights, or sometimes 3 nights, depending on the version you read, in Skadi's mountain home, Rimheim, Thunderhome, And then 9 nights in NJRR's Seaside Hall, Noton. A sort of ancient, divine version of a long-distance relationship with visitation rights. What could possibly go wrong with splitting your time between a snowy mountain fortress and a salty seaside villa? They tried Skadi's home first. Brimhamr is described as being high in the mountains, cold, wild, and rugged. For Skadi, this was home. She loved the crisp air, the silent snow, the call of the wolves. For NJRR, it was less than ideal. After spending their allotted time there, he returned to Noton and expressed his misery in a verse preserved in the Grimnismal poem. He complained about the mountains, saying he hated them, that the wolves' howling sounded awful to him compared to the singing of swans by the sea. He couldn't sleep with the noise of the wolves. You can almost hear him whining, right? Ugh, the noise! And it's so cold. Where are the seagulls? Where's the lovely smell of salt and fish? Then they tried NJRS home, Noton by the sea. This was NJRS paradise, the sound of the waves, the cries of the gulls, the gentle sea breezes. For him, this was perfect tranquility. For Skadi? Not so much. After their time there, she returned to Rimhamr and recited her own verse, lamenting her time by the sea. She hated Noton, she said, because she couldn't sleep there due to the noise of the seagulls. She preferred the sound of the wolves. So, NJR hated the wolves and loved the seagulls, Skadi hated the seagulls and loved the wolves. It was a fundamental, sonic incompatibility, if nothing else. It's like one of you loves death metal and the other can only sleep to whale sounds. Not a recipe for domestic harmony. Unsurprisingly, this arrangement didn't last. Their natures were too different, their preferred environments too opposed. The marriage failed. Skadi and NJR separated. NJR returned to Noton permanently, and Skadi went back to her beloved Rimhamr in the mountains. She essentially divorced herself from the god of the sea to live in her wild, cold giant homeland. This failure of a god-giant marriage, driven by incompatible lifestyles and preferences, highlights that while alliances could be formed, the fundamental differences between the realms and the beings who inhabited them were significant and sometimes insurmountable. However, Skadi didn't simply disappear from the mythological stage after leaving NJRR. She remained a figure known to the gods and humans. She is often listed among the Aesir goddesses, even though she was born a giantess and returned to live in Jotunheim. This suggests a level of acceptance or integration into the divine world, despite her origins and her failed marriage. She is still associated with her giant heritage, the mountains, winter, skiing, hunting with a bow, but she is also counted among the divine. A mainstream historical fact here is that winter sports like skiing and snowshoeing were indeed important modes of transportation and hunting in ancient Scandinavia, particularly in the northern regions. The portrayal of Skadi as a skilled skier and huntress reflects the practical realities and cultural significance of these activities in the parts of the world where Norse myths originated and were preserved. Her connection to these activities makes her a figure deeply tied to the harsh, beautiful winter landscape of the north. Skadi's later life and connections are less detailed than her arrival in Asgard and her marriage, but there are hints in the sources. Some poems mention her being associated with the god Ullr, who is also linked to skiing, archery, and winter. This makes sense, they share similar domains and skills. There are also mentions, particularly in the Lokasenna poem, where Loki insults all the gods, of Skadi having a relationship with Odin after her separation from NJRR. Loki taunts Skadi by mentioning this, suggesting it was a known, perhaps scandalous, event. This potential relationship with the chief god himself further underscores her complex and sometimes intimate connections within the divine realm, even after her formal marriage to NJRR ended. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that Skadi's name, Skadi, is etymologically linked by some scholars to words meaning harm or damage, and it might even be related to the name Scandinavia. This potential linguistic connection between her name and the very land where these myths were told is fascinating, suggesting she might represent the wild, untamed, sometimes harsh nature of the landscape itself, a force that is both beautiful and potentially dangerous. It links her even more deeply to the physical world of mountains, ice, and challenging terrain. Historians still argue whether Skadi's inclusion among the Aesir, despite her giant lineage and return to Jotunheim, represents a genuine case of a giant integrating into the divine pantheon, or if it's more of a narrative convenience, listing important figures associated with the gods regardless of strict lineage. Does her story show the possibility of crossing the god-giant divide, or does it highlight the inherent difficulty of such transitions, as shown by her failed marriage? Regardless of the scholarly debate about the precise nature of her integration or the meaning of her name, Skadi remains a powerful and complex figure. She is a giantess defined by her independence, her connection to the wild, cold places, her grief, her demanding nature, and her willingness to confront the gods. She forced the Aesir to acknowledge her loss and compensate her according to their own laws. She entered into a marriage alliance, failed to compromise on her fundamental nature, and returned to her home, yet remained connected to the divine world. She is a surprisingly nuanced giantess, not just a monster, but a force of nature, a grieving daughter, a demanding negotiator, a failed wife, and a figure who found a place, however uneasy, within the complex tapestry of Norse mythology. She's proof that giants weren't just things to be fought. They were sometimes figures you had to negotiate with, marry, and even, apparently, laugh at crude jokes with. You've seen how a giantess like Skadi could force her way into the divine realm, demand justice, and even marry a god, albeit one she couldn't stand living with in the long run. Her story shows that the boundary between Asgard and Jotunheim wasn't always an impenetrable wall. Sometimes, it was a border you could cross, negotiate, and even form kinship across, however uncomfortably. But if you want to talk about blurring the lines, about the absolute deepest level of connection and intermingling between the gods and the giants, you have to go right to the top of the divine hierarchy. You have to talk about the Allfather himself, Odin. Because Odin, the chief of the Aesir, the god of gods, the one who governs Asgard and receives fallen warriors in Valhalla, he's not pure god. Not by lineage anyway. His mother was a giantess. Her name was Bestla. Think about that for a second. The most powerful, most complex, most revered deity in the Norse pantheon is the son of a giantess. It's like finding out Zeus's mom was a titan, which, actually, she was, Rhea. But that's Greek myth, stay focused. In the Norse world, the ultimate symbol of divine order and wisdom has roots deep in the ancient, wild realm of the Jotnar. Bestla was the daughter of a giant named Bjorn. Her husband, Odin's father, was Bor, the son of Buri, the very first god, who was, if you recall from way back at the beginning of time, licked into being from salty ice by the cosmic cow Ambla. So, Odin's dad was god royalty from the original stock, literally licked into shape by a cow. Talk about a unique family tree. Bestla and Bor had 3 sons together, Odin, Vili, and Vi. These 3 brothers are incredibly important in Norse cosmology. Along with Odin's giant ancestry through his mother Bestla, Vili and Vi also share this mixed heritage. And it was these 3 brothers, the half-giant sons of Bor and Bestla, who slew the primeval giant Ymir and used his body to create the world, as we touched on earlier. So, not only is the world created from a giant's body, but it's created by beings who are themselves part giant. The very fabric of existence is woven with giant threads, and the architects of the ordered cosmos have giant blood in their veins. This lineage is a mainstream historical fact within the mythological texts themselves. Both the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda list Bestla as Odin's mother and Bjorn as her father, making Odin's giant ancestry a fundamental part of his identity as presented in the primary sources. This wasn't a hidden detail, or a later addition, it's right there in the genealogies of the gods. It underscores the point that the relationship between gods and giants was never just one of simple, unadulterated enmity. What does it mean that Odin is half-giant? The myths don't explicitly dwell on this in terms of his personality or powers, but it's hard to ignore the potential implications. Could his relentless quest for knowledge, which led him to figures like Fafnir, a giant, and Mimir, often associated with giants or primordial beings, be linked to his mother's side of the family? Giants are often portrayed as possessing ancient knowledge, knowledge that predates the gods' reign. Perhaps Odin's giant heritage gives him a unique connection to these deep cosmic secrets, a sort of ancestral right to seek out and understand the primordial forces and histories that the Jotnar represent. Maybe it connects him more closely to the wild, untamed aspects of the cosmos, the very forces that the Aesir often seek to control or contain. Odin isn't just a god of order, he's also a god of magic, ***, which has ambiguous origins and is sometimes linked to the Vanir or even giantesses, a god of frenzy, ***, from which his name derives, and a god who walks among humans in disguise, often stirring up conflict. He's a boundary crosser, constantly venturing into other realms, like Jotunheim. Could some of this inherent wildness, this willingness to blur lines and seek power and knowledge outside of conventional divine spheres, be attributed to his giant ancestry? It certainly adds a layer of complexity to his character. He's not just fighting the giants, he's literally fighting his cousins, maybe even his uncles. Imagine Thanksgiving at that family's house. Awkward. A quirky or fringe tidbit about Bestla is that beyond her name and parentage, the Eddas provide almost no information about her character, her life, or her relationship with Bor or her sons. She exists primarily in the genealogies as a crucial link between the divine and giant races at the very beginning of time. This lack of detail has led some scholars to speculate about her role. Was she a passive figure, or did she represent a specific quality or power that she passed on to her sons? Her silence in the myths is perhaps as intriguing as the knowledge possessed by giants like Fafnir. What did the Allfather's giantess mother know? We simply aren't told. Historians still argue whether Bestla's lineage was always intended to give Odin specific giant-like traits or insights, or if it simply reflects an older tradition of cosmic intermingling before the clear god-giant dichotomy solidified in later narratives. Was her role primarily genealogical, establishing a connection between the primordial giant race and the ruling gods, or was there a deeper mythological significance to Odin specifically being born of a giantess? The texts don't provide a clear answer, leaving it open to interpretation. The fact remains that the king of the gods, the ultimate authority figure in Asgard, is fundamentally connected to the giant race. This isn't just a minor god marrying a giantess. This is the very foundation of the divine leadership having roots in Jotunheim. It makes the constant conflict between gods and giants seem less like a simple battle of good versus evil and more like a complex, even familial, struggle for dominance and order in the cosmos. The Jotnar aren't just external enemies. They are the ancient relatives, the wild ancestors, the source from which even the gods themselves partially sprang. So, as you contemplate Odin's complex nature, remember his mother, Bestla, the giantess daughter of Blorn. She represents a fundamental truth about the Norse mythological world. The lines are blurred, the connections are deep, and the giants are not just the other. They are intertwined with the very essence of the divine, proving that even at the highest levels, the surprisingly thoughtful and ancient world of the giants had a profound impact. Odin's wisdom, his power, his very being, is inextricably linked to his giant heritage, a constant reminder that the wild, ancient forces represented by the Jotnar are never truly separate from the ordered world of the gods. They are, in a very real sense, family. Albeit, the kind of family that might try to smash your house down sometimes. So, you've just considered the truly mind-bending fact that the very chief of the gods, Odin himself, has giant blood running through his veins thanks to his mother, Bestla. This complicates the simple us versus them narrative immensely, suggesting a deep, ancient connection between the divine and the giant realms. And perhaps, just perhaps, Odin's relentless, sometimes dangerous, pursuit of wisdom, the thing he values above almost everything else, might be linked to this heritage. After all, as we saw with Fafnir, giants can be incredible repositories of ancient knowledge. And nowhere is the link between ancient wisdom and a figure associated with the giant realm more apparent than with the mysterious being known as Mimir and his famous well. Imagine the great world tree, Yggdrasil, its roots stretching down into the various realms of the cosmos. One of those roots reaches into the realm of the frost giants, and near this root lies a well of immense significance. This is Mimir's well, the source of wisdom and intelligence. And the guardian of this well, the one who holds the key to its profound knowledge, is Mimir. Now, Mimir is a figure whose exact nature and lineage are debated in the myths themselves, which only adds to his mystique. Sometimes he's explicitly called a giant, Jotun *. Other times, he's simply referred to as an ancient being, a wise entity whose existence predates much of the current cosmic order. Some scholars have even linked him to the Vanir gods or seen him as a primordial force personified. But regardless of his precise classification, his association with ancient wisdom and his dwelling place near the roots that touch Jotunheim firmly place him outside the conventional Asur pantheon and connect him to the older, wilder, primordial aspects of the cosmos, often represented by the giants. He's the ultimate ancient librarian, and his library is a pool of magical water. Odin, in his insatiable quest for knowledge, learns of Mimir's well and the wisdom it contains. He knows that to gain this ultimate understanding, he must pay a price. He travels to the well, seeking Mimir, and asks for a drink. Mimir, the stern guardian, agrees, but only in exchange for one of Odin's eyes. This is a monumental sacrifice. Odin, the Allfather, willingly plucks out one of his own eyes and gives it to Mimir as a pledge, a payment for a single draught from the well. Imagine the pain, the finality of that act, all for the sake of knowledge. It really puts that time you stayed up all night cramming for a test into perspective, doesn't it? Odin literally gave an arm and a leg, well, an eye, for his education. This sacrifice underscores the incredible value placed on the wisdom held by Mimir. It wasn't something freely given, it demanded the highest possible price from the chief of the gods. What knowledge did Odin gain from that single drink? The myths don't spell it out explicitly, but it's understood to be cosmic understanding, insight into the workings of the universe, perhaps even glimpses of the future. This knowledge, crucial to Odin's power and authority, comes from a source guarded by a being deeply connected to the ancient, non-Asur aspects of the world, whether you call Mimir a giant, an ancient being, or something else. Mimir's story doesn't end there, though his fate is tragic. During the Asur-Vanir War, a conflict between the two tribes of gods before they made peace and intermingled, Mimir was sent to the Vanir as part of a hostage exchange. The Vanir, perhaps distrusting him or misunderstanding his value, cut off his head and sent it back to Odin. This is a pretty brutal turn of events for the guardian of wisdom. But even death doesn't stop Mimir from dispensing knowledge. Odin, receiving the severed head of his wise advisor and the keeper of the well from which he gained so much, isn't about to let all that wisdom go to waste. He uses magic, herbs, and spells to preserve Mimir's head, ensuring it cannot decay. He then carries the head with him, placing it by the well or keeping it near, and consults it for counsel. The preserved head of Mimir continues to speak, offering Odin advice and sharing its ancient wisdom. It's definitely a quirky or fringe tidbit, the chief god carrying around a talking, disembodied head for advice. Like having the world's smartest, creepiest bobblehead. This continued consultation with Mimir's head is mentioned in various poems. It signifies that Mimir's wisdom was not lost with his body. It resided within his very being, accessible even after death. It's a powerful image of wisdom persisting beyond physical form and being sought out by the highest deity. A mainstream historical fact here is that the concept of severed heads retaining power or wisdom, or being consulted for prophecy or advice, appears in various mythologies and folklore traditions across different cultures. Think of the head of Bran the Blessed in Welsh myth, which continued to speak and prophesy after being cut off. This motif reflects ancient beliefs about the soul or consciousness residing in the head and the power associated with relics or remains of significant beings. Mimir's association with giants reinforces the idea that these beings, or the ancient forces they represent, were seen as possessing knowledge that was fundamental and perhaps even inaccessible to the younger gods through conventional means. Odin, despite being the god of wisdom, had to go to Mimir, a being outside the Asur, and pay a heavy price to gain a certain level of understanding. This suggests that the deepest layers of cosmic lore were held by entities connected to the primordial world, the world that existed before the Asur established their rule, the world of Amur, and, by extension, the Jotnar. Historians still argue whether Mimir was originally conceived as a giant, a Vanir god, or a unique primordial being, and what his precise relationship was to the well he guarded. Does his ambiguous nature suggest a fluidity between the different races and cosmic forces in early Norse belief, or is it simply a result of different traditions being combined in the Eddas? This open scholarly debate highlights the difficulty in neatly categorizing figures like Mimir within the mythological structure, underscoring the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of the source material when it comes to defining the boundaries between gods, giants, and other ancient entities. Regardless of the scholarly debate about his exact origins, Mimir stands as a crucial figure in the Norse cosmos. He is the guardian of the Well of Wisdom, a source of knowledge so profound that Odin sacrifices an eye for a single drink. He is associated with the ancient realms, often linked to the giants, and his wisdom persists even after death. He represents the deep, primordial knowledge that lies at the roots of existence, a knowledge that the gods themselves must seek out and pay dearly for. Through Mimir, we see another facet of the giant world, or the world associated with ancient, non-Asur beings, not just brute force or chaotic destruction, but profound, ancient, and surprisingly thoughtful wisdom, guarded by a being who literally gives his head for the cause. Well, his head is the cause, after he gives it up. So, you've peered into the depths of Mimir's well, seen the price Odin paid for wisdom, and understood that figures associated with the ancient, non-Asur realms, often linked to giants, held keys to profound cosmic knowledge. Mimir was ancient, wise, perhaps a giant, perhaps something else, but undeniably tied to the deepest roots of the world. And speaking of the deepest roots, and the most ancient beings of all, we have to go back, way, way back, before the gods as you know them, before Midgard, before Asgard, before pretty much anything. We have to talk about the very first being to exist in the Norse cosmos, a giant, but a giant of a fundamentally different kind from those we've discussed, the primeval giant Ymir. Imagine the vast, empty void that existed before creation. In the Norse myths, this was Ginnungagap, the yawning gap, bordered on one side by the icy, misty realm of Niflheim and on the other by the fiery realm of Muspelheim. When the ice from Niflheim met the heat from Muspelheim in the middle of Ginnungagap, something began to stir. From the mingling of these primal forces, life emerged. And the very first life form was Ymir. The myths describe him emerging from the melting ice, a colossal being, the progenitor of the frost giants. Now, Ymir wasn't like Vafnir, sitting in a hall dispensing wisdom, or Gymir, guarding his beautiful daughter. Ymir was less a character and more a force of nature, the raw, chaotic material of the cosmos in its earliest, unformed state. He wasn't built like later beings, he simply was, immense and ancient. The myths even get a little weird about how his descendants came about. They say that while he slept, frost giants sweated from his armpits and legs, giving rise to the race of Jotnar. Yes, you heard that right. The ancient, powerful race of giants traces its lineage back to armpit sweat. It's perhaps not the most dignified origin story, but it certainly highlights their primordial, earthy, and somewhat chaotic nature. Makes you think twice about hitting the gym, doesn't it? Ymir wasn't just the first being, he was the source material for everything else. As we briefly touched on when discussing Odin's lineage, it was Odin and his brothers, Vili and Vi, the sons of the god Bor and the giantess Bestla. Remember Bestla, Odin's giantess mom? Her dad was Blorn, a giant, linking her back to this ancient stock, who ultimately slew Ymir. This act, while violent, was not simply destruction. It was the necessary step to bring order out of chaos, to create the world. They took Ymir's vast body and used it to fashion the cosmos as the Norse knew it. His flesh became the earth, his blood the seas and lakes, his bones the mountains, his hair the forests, his skull the sky held up by 4 dwarves, and his brains the clouds. Even the dwarves themselves are sometimes said to have originated from the maggots that crawled in Ymir's flesh. The world of gods, humans, and other beings is literally built from the body of this primeval giant. This myth is foundational to Norse cosmology. It presents a giant figure not as an external enemy to be fought off, but as the very ground upon which existence is built. Ymir is the primordial soup, the raw, unshaped potential that the younger gods took and formed into the ordered world. He represents the chaotic, unformed state of the universe before divine will impose structure. He is the other, not in the sense of an antagonist seeking to undo creation, but in the sense of the fundamental, wild, untamed matter that was before creation. It's hard to get more integrated into the fabric of reality than being turned into the fabric of reality itself. Contrast this with the later giants we've been exploring. Vafnir is a being of immense intellect, a scholar of the cosmos. Gymer is a patriarch, the head of a household. Skadi is a grieving daughter, a demanding negotiator, an independent spirit. Bestla is a mother, part of a divine genealogy. These giants, while often immense in size and tied to wild places, are portrayed with personalities, relationships, motivations, and roles that go beyond just existing as raw material. They are individuals, albeit powerful and ancient ones, who interact with the gods in complex ways, through wisdom contests, marriages, demands for justice, and kinship. Ymir, on the other hand, has no personality in the myths. He doesn't speak, he doesn't scheme, he doesn't negotiate. He simply is the first being, the source, the giant from whom all later giants are descended, or from whose body parts the world is made, depending on the specific detail. He is the past, the primordial, the chaotic origin point. The later giants are the descendants, the inheritors of that ancient lineage, who have developed into distinct beings with their own characteristics. It's the difference between talking about water, Ymir, the elemental source, and talking about a specific river with rapids and fish. Later giants, defined entities within the world. A mainstream historical fact here is that creation myths involving the dismemberment of a primordial being to create the world, often called cosmogonic myths, are found in many cultures around the globe, not just Norse mythology. Think of the Babylonian epic Enuma Elish, where the goddess Tiamat is slain and her body is used to create the heavens and the earth. This suggests that the Norse myth of Ymir's dismemberment for creation fits into a broader, ancient human pattern of explaining the origins of the world by linking it to the sacrifice or transformation of a primeval entity. The myths sometimes distinguish between different types of Jotnar, referring to frost giants, ****, as descendants of Ymir, while the term Jotun itself might encompass a broader category of ancient, powerful beings associated with the wild realms. This distinction, while not always strictly maintained in the poems, hints at a recognition that the giant race had layers and variations, stemming from their primordial ancestor, but evolving over time. A quirky or fringe tidbit about Ymir is that the name Ymir itself is thought by some scholars to be related to Old Norse words meaning twin, or hermaphrodite, suggesting he might have been seen as a self-generating, dual-natured being, embodying opposing forces within himself before the separation into distinct realms and beings. This interpretation adds another layer to his role as the undifferentiated, primordial source from which everything sprang. Historians still argue whether the myth of Ymir represents the oldest layer of Norse creation beliefs, or if it developed alongside or was influenced by other traditions. They also debate the precise relationship between Ymir and the later, more anthropomorphic giants. Is Ymir simply the ultimate ancestor, or does he represent a fundamentally different category of being? A cosmic entity rather than a giant in the later sense? This open scholarly debate highlights the complex and sometimes shifting nature of mythological concepts across different time periods and sources. So, while Ymir is undeniably a giant, perhaps the giant from whom the race sprang, he stands apart from figures like Fafnir, Skadi, and Gymer. He is the ancient foundation, the chaotic source material, the body of the world itself. Understanding Ymir helps us see that the term giant in Norse myth isn't a single, simple category. It encompasses the most ancient, elemental forces of the cosmos and later, more developed beings who, while powerful and tied to the wild, also possess wisdom, personality, and complex relationships, proving that the giants were far more than just mindless monsters. They were, at their very roots, the very fabric of existence. So, you've traveled back in time, deep into the primordial void, to encounter Ymir, the colossal source from which the very world was built. He was a giant, yes, but a giant of chaos and raw material, fundamentally different from the more defined beings who came after him. And now you're looking at those later giants, the descendants, the ones who inhabit Jotunheim and sometimes interact with the gods. You've seen giants of immense wisdom like Vafnir, powerful patriarchs like Gymir, and independent, demanding figures like Skadi. These examples already push back against the simple, brutish monster stereotype. But what about the idea that some giants weren't just complex individuals who interacted with the gods, but were actually, in various ways, accepted or integrated into the world of the Aesir themselves? This isn't about a temporary truce. This is about kinship, alliance, and finding a place, however uncomfortable, within the divine realm. This concept of giants being accepted among the gods is perhaps the strongest evidence that the relationship between the two races was far more nuanced than just eternal warfare. It wasn't a one-way street of gods attacking giants. Sometimes, the giants, or at least specific giants, found their way across the boundary and into the heart of the divine world. And the reasons for this acceptance varied, reflecting the complex motivations and needs of the gods themselves: kinship, strategic alliance, the pursuit of knowledge, or simply the acknowledgement of powerful, ancient beings. Let's start with the most fundamental form of integration we've already touched upon: kinship. Remember Bestla? Odin's mother. The Allfather, the chief of the Aesir, the god of wisdom, magic, and war, is the son of a giantess. This isn't a secret shame. It's part of his recorded lineage in the mythological texts. His brothers, Vili and Vi, who helped him create the world, also share this giant ancestry. This means that the very rulers of Asgard have giant blood. This isn't just acceptance. This is foundational integration. It suggests that at the earliest levels of the Norse cosmos, the lines between gods and giants were not just blurred, but actively intermingled. The Jotnar weren't just the other, they were also the ancient relatives, the ancestral stock from which the divine leadership partially sprang. Imagine having your family reunion include both thunder gods and frost giants. The potluck must be intense. Then there's acceptance through marriage and alliance. We saw this with Freyr and Geir. Freyr, a major god of the Vanir, fell head over heels for the beautiful giantess Geir, daughter of Gymir. Despite the perilous journey and the need for Skirnir to use threats, the story ends with Geir agreeing to marry Freyr. While she remains connected to her giant homeland, she becomes Freyr's wife, a part of the divine world through this union. This wasn't just a fleeting romance. It was a marriage that created a bond between a key god and a prominent giant family. Marriage, in ancient societies, was a powerful tool for forging alliances and establishing peace, even between potentially hostile groups. The myths applying this concept to gods and giants underscores the possibility of bridging the divide through formalized relationships. Skadi's story is another prime example of a giantess finding a place, however difficult, among the gods. She came to Asgard as a grieving daughter seeking justice, an outsider demanding compensation. But through negotiation, she secured not just symbolic gestures, Loki's bizarre performance, her father's eyes as stars, but also a marriage into the divine family, becoming Njr's wife. While that particular marriage failed due to incompatible living preferences, mountain versus sea, who knew seagulls could be such a deal-breaker? Skadi didn't simply cease to exist in the god sphere. She is often listed among the Aesir goddesses in mythological texts, despite returning to her mountain home in Jotunheim. This suggests a level of formal, or informal acceptance into the divine pantheon, acknowledging her status and power even after the alliance of marriage dissolved. She earned her place not through battle, but through demanding negotiation and a temporary, strategic marriage. A mainstream historical fact relevant here is the importance of kinship and marital alliances in structuring power and relationships in ancient Germanic and Scandinavian societies. Genealogies were crucial for establishing legitimacy and status, and marriages between powerful families or individuals were key tools for diplomacy and consolidating influence. The mythological narratives featuring gods and giants intermarrying or tracing lineage back to giants reflect this cultural emphasis on kinship and alliance as fundamental ways of defining relationships, even across perceived boundaries between different groups or races. consider Mimir again. While his exact nature is debated, giant, Vanir, primordial being, his association with the ancient realms and his role as the guardian of the well of wisdom place him outside the conventional Aesir. Yet Odin doesn't seek to destroy Mimir. He seeks his wisdom. He pays an immense price, an eye, to gain knowledge from this being connected to the giant world. Furthermore, even after Mimir's head is severed, Odin preserves it and continues to consult it for counsel. This isn't acceptance into his guardian's society in the sense of living there, but it's a profound form of intellectual and spiritual integration. Mimir's wisdom is valued and incorporated into Odin's own authority and understanding of the cosmos. He is accepted as a source of vital knowledge, despite his non-Aesir status. These examples, Bestla's motherhood of Odin, Gareth's marriage to Freyr, Skadi's marriage to Njrr and her listing among the Aesir, Mimir's role as Odin's advisor, demonstrate that the Jotnar were not uniformly excluded or simply viewed as enemies. Specific individuals, particularly giantesses, could form lasting bonds with the gods through marriage, bringing their lineage and sometimes their unique perspectives or powers into the divine realm. Other figures, like Mimir, were valued for the ancient knowledge they possessed, knowledge that the gods themselves needed to acquire, even at great cost. A quirky or fringe tidbit often noted by scholars is that the term Aesir, which refers to the goddesses, sometimes includes figures of giant lineage, like Skadi, or figures whose origins are ambiguous but tied to the ancient world. This inclusion in lists of goddesses, even if they don't reside permanently in Asgard, further suggests a flexibility in the mythological classification and a willingness to count powerful female figures of non-Aesir origin among the divine. It highlights that power, status, and connection could sometimes transcend strict racial or geographical boundaries in the mythological world. Historians still argue whether these instances of giants being accepted or integrated into the divine realm represent a genuine reflection of complex, sometimes fluid relationships between different cosmic forces in older Norse beliefs, or if they are primarily narrative devices used by the compilers of the Eddas centuries later to weave together disparate stories and lineages into a more coherent, albeit still contradictory, mythological tapestry. Does this acceptance indicate that the Jotnar were not always seen as fundamentally opposed to the gods? Or are these just exceptions that prove the general rule of enmity? Regardless of the scholarly debate, the presence of these figures within the divine sphere is undeniable. They demonstrate that the Jotnar were capable of more than just conflict. They could be mothers, wives, sources of wisdom, and figures whose status demanded negotiation and acknowledgement from the gods themselves. They challenge the simplistic stereotype and reveal a mythological world where the boundaries between realms and races were sometimes permeable, allowing for surprising instances of acceptance and integration between the seemingly opposed worlds of gods and giants. It turns out not all giants were trying to break into Asgard to steal something. Some were invited in, or were already family. So, you've peered into the divine family tree and seen that the very chief of the gods, Odin, is himself part giant, born of Bestla. You've seen giants like Skadi negotiate their way into alliances and even temporary divine status, and Mimir, the guardian of wisdom, consulted by the Allfather himself. These are prominent examples that shatter the simple stereotype of the brutish, chaotic giant. But the nuances don't stop there. If you dig a little deeper, beyond the most famous sagas of Thor bashing heads or Freyr wooing a beautiful maiden, you find even quieter whispers in the Eddic poems, less famous references that hint at giants who weren't necessarily hostile, or at least weren't always depicted as immediate threats waiting to be smote. These glimpses are often fleeting, sometimes just a name in a list, a brief mention in a description of a place, or a minor role in a story whose main focus is elsewhere. They don't get the epic narrative treatment of a wisdom contest or a high-stakes courtship. But their presence in the myths is significant precisely because they don't fit the standard antagonist mold. They suggest that the Norse understanding of the Jotnar was perhaps more expansive than the conflict narratives alone would indicate. It's like finding a single, quiet resident in a town known mostly for its rowdy festivals. They might not define the place, but they show there's more to it than meets the eye. Consider the funeral of Baldur, the beloved god of light and beauty. When Baldur is killed and the gods prepare his magnificent funeral ship, Ringhorni, to send him off to the underworld, they find they cannot launch it. It's too heavy, too grand. Who do they turn to for help with this immense task? Not Thor, the strongest of the gods. They send for a giantess named Hyrrokin, who lives in the far reaches of Jotunheim. She arrives riding a wolf, using snakes as reins, a pretty metal entrance, honestly. But her purpose isn't hostile. She dismounts, and with a single shove, she launches the massive ship into the sea. Thor, ever the hothead, is immediately angered by this powerful giantess and wants to smash her with Mjolnir, but the other gods restrain him. Hyrrokin isn't attacked. She's compensated for her help, though the details are vague. Here is a giantess, summoned by the gods, performing a crucial, non-hostile service at one of their most solemn moments. She's not trying to disrupt the funeral, she's enabling it. This is a far cry from the giants who try to kidnap goddesses or steal divine artifacts. Then there are the descriptions of Jotunheim itself in some poems. While often portrayed as a wild, dangerous frontier, the land of the giants is sometimes described in ways that suggest it's simply another realm, different from Asgard or Midgard, but not solely defined by hostility. We hear of rivers and mountains, yes, but also sometimes of halls and dwelling places where giants reside, implying a settled existence, not just nomadic raiding. This hints at a world with its own geography, its own inhabitants, living their lives, perhaps mostly uninterested in the affairs of the gods unless provoked or allied with. It's the wild, untamed part of the cosmos, but it's also their home. Imagine driving through a beautiful, remote wilderness area. It's wild, maybe a little intimidating, but it's also home to the animals and plants that live there, who are just doing their thing. Some poems, particularly those focused on cosmology or the listing of names, mention giants in contexts that aren't about conflict at all. These might be genealogical lists, names of ancient beings, or figures associated with specific places or natural phenomena without being antagonists. These mentions, while lacking detailed stories, contribute to the picture of the Jotnar as an ancient, diverse race that is simply part of the fabric of the cosmos, existing alongside gods, dwarves, elves, and humans. They are beings who are, not just beings who fight. A mainstream historical fact here is that the Poetic Edda, one of our main sources for these myths, is a collection of poems compiled centuries after the Viking Age, drawing on older traditions. The poems themselves vary in age, style, and focus, and they weren't necessarily intended to form a single, perfectly consistent narrative about the giants. This fragmented nature means we get snapshots of different beliefs or different portrayals of giants from various times and contexts, some focusing on conflict, others simply acknowledging their existence as part of the mythological world. Another interesting, though debated, instance comes from the poem Hvarselj, a flyting, a poetic boasting and insult match, between Odin, disguised as Hvar, and Thor. During the exchange, Odin as Hvar taunts Thor, claiming he spent time with a giantess on an island and that she nursed him. Now, this could be a metaphorical insult, implying Thor was weak or dependent. But it could also be a reference to a lesser-known tale where Thor had some kind of non-hostile interaction with a giantess, perhaps receiving aid or sustenance. The ambiguity itself is fascinating. Even in a poem focused on conflict, a flyting, there's a hint of a possible story where a giantess wasn't an enemy, but someone who provided something, even if in a strange or insulting context. It's like someone making a joke about that time your weird aunt gave you questionable cookies. The joke lands because the underlying event, however strange, happened. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some interpretations of giant names suggest connections not just to size or destruction, but to specific natural features or forces. Names might relate to mountains, rivers, ice, or the sea, reinforcing the idea that the Jotnar were seen as deeply intertwined with the physical, wild landscape of the world, rather than just being humanoid figures in it. Their very names link them to the ancient, untamed aspects of nature. Historians still argue whether these scattered references to non-hostile or integrated giants represent remnants of older beliefs where the giants were seen less as antagonists and more as primordial forces or simply inhabitants of a different realm, or if they are simply minor characters whose roles didn't require them to be enemies in those specific narrative contexts. Does the existence of giants like Hyrrokin or the possibility of a giantess nursing Thor suggest a more fluid boundary between gods and giants in earlier traditions? Or are they simply exceptions to the general rule of enmity driven by specific plot needs? These less famous examples, these quiet mentions in the Eddas, serve as important reminders that the Norse mythological landscape is incredibly rich and complex. Beyond the thunderous battles and epic confrontations, there were other ways of viewing the Jotnar, as ancient inhabitants of their own realm, as beings capable of providing aid, as figures woven into the very fabric of the cosmos in ways that went beyond simple conflict. They add depth and texture to the picture, showing that the surprisingly thoughtful and sometimes gentle aspects of the giants were present in the myths, even in the quieter corners of the tales. They weren't always swinging clubs, sometimes they were just there, living their lives, or helping out in a pinch. So, you've seen how the Jotnar weren't just a single, simple group of monsters. You've met the wise ones, the powerful patriarchs, the demanding daughters, and even the mothers of gods. You've glimpsed the fact that some giants weren't always hostile, sometimes providing aid or simply existing in the background of the myths, like the giantess Hyrrokin who launched Baldur's ship, or the possibility of a giantess nursing Thor in a forgotten tale. This all points to a much richer, more complex picture than the standard stereotype allows. And nowhere is that complexity more evident than in the very realm they inhabit, Jotunheim. You picture it, right? A desolate wasteland of ice and rock, perpetually shrouded in mist and cold, a place where nothing grows and everything wants to kill you. And yes, Jotunheim is often described as wild, dangerous, and on the fringes of the ordered cosmos. It's a realm of mountains, forests, and frozen wastes, a place where the forces of nature are raw and untamed. It's definitely not somewhere you'd want to book a vacation, even with a good travel agent and a sturdy pair of boots. The journey there from Midgard or Asgard is consistently portrayed as difficult and perilous, crossing raging rivers, vast plains, and treacherous mountains. It's the ultimate frontier, the edge of the known world, where the rules are different and the inhabitants are formidable. But to see Jotunheim only as a hostile wilderness is to miss another layer of its portrayal in the myths, a layer that connects deeply to the surprisingly thoughtful aspects of its inhabitants. While it is wild, it's also ancient. It's the realm closest to the primordial forces, tied to the very origins of the cosmos. Remember Ymir, the primeval giant from whose body the world was made. He emerged from the mingling of fire and ice in the great void, and the frost giants, his descendants, are intrinsically linked to the cold, wild places. Jotunheim is their home, the place where the ancient roots of existence run deepest. Think back to the halls we've mentioned. Vafnir had a hall where Odin found him, a place significant enough for a wisdom contest to take place. Gymir, Gareth's father, lived in a dwelling described as formidable and guarded, implying a settled structure, a place of power and wealth within the giant's realm. These aren't just temporary shelters, they suggest a form of society, of established living places, within Jotunheim. While perhaps not as gleaming or ordered as Asgard, the giants have their own domains, their own places where they gather, feast, and conduct their affairs. It's like the difference between a bustling city and a remote mountain village. Both are inhabited, but in very different ways. This realm is also portrayed as a repository of ancient knowledge. We saw this explicitly with Mimir's Well, located near a root of Yggdrasil that reaches into the realm of the frost giants. The source of ultimate wisdom is found there, in or near Jotunheim, guarded by a being associated with the giants or ancient forces. Vafnir, the wisest of giants, resides in Jotunheim and holds knowledge of cosmic history and prophecy that even Odin lacks. This suggests that Jotunheim isn't just a place of physical danger, it's a place where the deepest secrets of the cosmos are kept, where the ancient past is remembered, and where the threads of fate are perhaps more visible than elsewhere. It's the world's oldest library, located in the middle of a blizzard and guarded by formidable beings. The environment of Jotunheim itself can be seen as reflecting the nature of the Jotnar. It is raw, powerful, sometimes destructive, but also possessing a stark, ancient beauty and a deep connection to the fundamental forces of the world. It is a place of immense mountains, the bones of Ymir, vast forests his hair, and deep waters his blood? The giants, living within this landscape, are part of it. They embody its wildness, its strength, its unpredictable nature. But just as a mountain range can be both dangerous and awe-inspiring, both a barrier and a source of ancient stone, the giants too embody these dualities. Their environment is not just a backdrop for battles, it is integral to who and what they are. A mainstream historical fact here is that the geography of Scandinavia, with its rugged coastlines, deep fjords, vast forests, and imposing mountain ranges, profoundly shaped the worldview and mythological imagination of the Norse peoples. The concept of distinct realms like Asgard, perhaps reflecting more ordered human settlements or cultivated lands, Midgard, the human world, and Jotunheim, the wild, untamed frontier, likely drew inspiration from the diverse and challenging physical landscape they inhabited. Jotunheim, in particular, embodies the awe and danger associated with the remote, natural world beyond the limits of human control. Some descriptions even hint at a certain melancholy or ancient weariness associated with the Jotnar and their realm. They are the old race, perhaps aware of their eventual fate at Ragnarok, tied to a world that will ultimately be destroyed. This isn't the mindless rage of simple monsters. It's a deeper, more complex emotional state that fits a race connected to the ancient past and the inevitable future. Their environment, vast and indifferent, might reflect this sense of ancientness and fate. A quirky or fringe tidbit you might find interesting is that some place names in Norse mythology, particularly those associated with Jotunheim or the realms of giants, are thought by some scholars to be derived from Old Norse words describing geological features or natural phenomena, further emphasizing the deep connection between the giants and the physical landscape. Names might literally mean Stonefield Ice Mountain or Forest Dwelling, suggesting that the realms and their inhabitants were seen as almost synonymous with the natural world in its most ancient and untamed forms. Historians still argue whether the very descriptions of Jotunheim in the Eddas, sometimes a desolate wilderness, sometimes a place with halls and rivers, reflect different regional traditions, different time periods of myth development, or simply the fluid and sometimes contradictory nature of mythological geography. Does the portrayal of halls and settled places suggest a recognition of giant society, or are these simply narrative conveniences to allow for interaction with the gods? This open scholarly debate highlights the challenge of building a consistent map of the mythological cosmos from fragmented poetic and prose sources. Ultimately, Jotunheim is more than just a battleground. It is the realm of ancient nature, of primordial forces, of deep time, and of hidden wisdom. It is the home of beings who, while often antagonists, are also complex individuals tied to the very fabric of the cosmos. Understanding Jotunheim as a multifaceted realm, not solely defined by hostility, helps us appreciate the equally multifaceted nature of its inhabitants, the Jotnar. They are the wild, the ancient, the wise, and the sometimes surprisingly thoughtful giants who belong to this powerful and complex corner of the Norse mythological world. It's their turf, and it's as complicated as they are.